they made a mistake. But
Did
regardless,
they
I want
leave
to
a
tell you,
note or anything? Did
I
they
don't
leave a note?
not that I've heard of, other than
They had a
immediately
manifesto.
immediately after the police. I know I haven't heard it. I mean, I know they did, but
Okay.
I haven't heard it. But the police
I have,
said that that the materials that they found, they hated everybody. I mean, they didn't hate everybody. I forget what the words he said, but they had hate directed at many groups. Okay,
But
but I
we were
want to
driving down the 805 Monday morning, and there must have been 150 police cars right there at the off ramp.
yeah, but I'm going to read to you what my friend Bruce Levine said, who was there. He's a Jewish guy. He's a friend of mine in San Diego, and about a little older, but basically my age. And he's originally from Detroit, and so he actually posted several things about the Temple Israel shooting because that was the synagogue he grew up, one of the synagogues he grew up in Detroit. So he had posted about that. But I just want you to hear what he said. He went to the interfaith gathering that night. And I want you to, I posted it up so you can see it, but I want to read it to you. This evening, I attended the interfaith gathering at Lindbergh Neighborhood Park. It brought to mind the Vigil for Israel, a show of community solidarity on October 10th, 2023, but for different reasons. By the way, my daughter was there and she knows Bruce too. They were both there that night on October 10th, which was the vigil after October 7th. The 2023 event was a Jewish community solidarity vigil, never billed as an interfaith gathering, and having been there, I can confirm it wasn't, which was appropriate for that moment. Tonight's event, however, was explicitly framed as an interfaith gathering, yet it didn't quite live up to its billing. The stage tonight featured a massive lineup of speakers, Muslim religious leaders and activists, activists from various other community organizations, politicians, union representatives, a few Christian leaders, a Native American spokesman, and families of terrorism victims killed at the mosque. As a Jew, I attended out of a sense of obligation to support the Muslim community in my hyperlocal neighborhood during this difficult time. He lives there. He lives in the area of Claremont. I left with mixed feelings. Despite countless references to interfaith solidarity, community gatherings, and shared values, only one speaker had the courage to explicitly mention a temple or synagogue. Similarly, out of the entire lineup, only Yusuf Miller had the courage to use the word Jewish when defending the right of all faiths to worship and educate their children without fear. He's a leader I know personally from our shared work donating and delivering food and water to San Diego's unhoused population. To the profound credit of the assembled crowd, these specific acknowledgments were met with total respect. There was no booing, no tension, and nothing untoward from the audience. There were no announced Jewish speakers or representatives. I don't know if Jewish leaders simply didn't ask to participate or if they were excluded. But despite some truly wonderful expressions of community, the glaring omission made tonight feel less than a true interfaith event. One speaker went so far as to list nearly every faith imaginable, including atheists and agnostics, while failing to mention Jews as if we were the third rail of society. Wonderful things were said tonight, and I sincerely hope the speakers truly mean those beautiful sentiments for everyone. So this is what he said, and I can only tell you that of the rabbis that I spoke to in San Diego, none of them were invited to come. I don't believe that there were any rabbis that were invited to come to participate in it. And I'm going to tell you that Bruce is not a conservative, politically conservative. He's not a raging Islamophobic whatever. He went there to express his solidarity, and he left feeling like, again, you read what he wrote. So um, that's unfortunately, I wasn't shocked at reading that, but I was disappointed. And I spoke to a few rabbis, and I don't know if others were invited and didn't come. I don't believe a rabbi was invited who didn't come, but could be wrong. But I didn't speak to the rabbis I spoke to did not get invited. So I don't believe that there was a rabbi invited to participate in the event. So, I didn't want to bring this up because I want to bring everybody down right now, but because it's already a sad situation, but it is a very sad situation that we're in a situation right now where even in a situation like this, where I think we as Jews have something to add and something to share at a situation like this. So with that, let's talk about a little bit of what makes these days so challenging. And a lot of it obviously emanates out of Israel and out of the history. But as we're going to see today, that's not really, of course, the basis for much of the anti-Semitism and the Jew hatred that's directed at us. But, you know, we're going to talk about the history of Israel today. Last time, 2 weeks ago, when we were together, we looked at the beginning of Israel's existence, really focusing on the War of Independence, the Declaration of Independence, the War of Independence that followed, and we talked a lot about immigration. And I wanted to show you how the immigration to Israel really tells the story of of the of the how the nation was built. Today we are going to talk a little bit more about the wars, the battles that were fought as part of Israel's um, early years, and then next week we're going to kind of finish up with the last 30 years or so. So today we're really kind of going from the 50s until the late 70s, early 80s. And what I've put up here, and all of this is also available online on our website with the our page online, which has our materials for the classes, is this prime ministers of Israel chart, which, by the way, um, I created it with the help of AI. I hadn't I was looking for this. I couldn't find it, and so created it. And this is a really great way of kind of understanding what happened with the the politics of Israel, which is last week when we talked, or last session when we talked about the beginning of Israel. I mentioned David Ben Gurion, um, one of the most significant leaders in Israel's history. Definitely up until recently, very significant because he was the longest serving prime minister until Netanyahu recently passed him. But you see, he was the first prime minister from 1948 till 1954. And then he came back and served for another period of time in the mid 50s to early 60s. Really important times, both of them in Israel's history. In between those two terms that he served, and remember, Israel has a coalition system in their government. When Israel was founded as a parliamentary democracy, where again there's 120 seats in the Knesset, which are basically divided up based on the votes that people get, based on the parties the party vote. And so when you voted for a party, there was a list, and the top of the list would be the person who would be the prime minister if that party got the most votes or put together the largest coalition. And down the list, those were the leaders of the party. And depending on how many seats you won, that would be how many of those people would get in. So if you were the 15th person on your list, on your party list, and you only got 14 seats, you were out of luck. But essentially, the party had tremendous power. And for the first 30 years of Israel, you can see from 1948 to 1977, the government was led by the Mapai, or the Labor Party. This was under Ben Gurion's leadership. This was a very left-wing government, a socialist government, and it was a government that was, at the time, really tried to navigate between very close relationships with the West, but also originally, as we mentioned before, one of the first countries that recognized Israel, and one of the countries that put Israel even to some extent on the map by voting as a member of the United Nations, the Soviet Union. And so Ben Gurion had several people in his government that had close ties to the Soviets, including, by the way, as we found out later, some people that were spying for the Soviets. But Ben Gurion had this job to try to develop Israel as a new country, and to navigate through the politics, and as we're going to see today, the global politics, because this really is coming together during the beginning of the Cold War. And Cold War politics had a tremendous effect on Israel's early days. And so Ben Gurion is the prime minister pretty much for the first when you see this 15 years of Israel's existence. That's a long time. But I will tell you, while many people thought that Ben Gurion kind of ruled as a dictator, they really needed to be that kind of stability and consistency. And so for this small period of time, almost 2 years that Moshe Sharet was the prime minister, and you can see the Lavon affair. That was actually the spine for the Soviet situation. This is 20 years, and we're going to talk about one of the wars that happened in Israel's existence during this time, during the time of up right up till when Sharet left, and then what happened in 56. We'll mention in a second. The next prime minister who serves, a serious amount of time is Levi Eshkol, and he's the next prime minister after Ben Gurion retires, and he's also from the same party and is also a follower or a student, if you will, of Ben Gurion. And then you have Yigal Allon, who takes over because Eshkol dies while he's serving as prime minister. And immediately after that, so he's only prime minister, as you see, for about a month. Most people even don't consider Yigal Allon prime minister. But then you have Golda Meir. And Golda Meir is the prime minister during the I didn't mention Levi Eshkol was the prime minister during the Six-Day War, but Golda Meir is the prime minister, as many of you know, during the Yom Kippur War. And then after Golda Meir resigns because of the Yom Kippur War, she left after the dust had settled, if you will. The War of Yom Kippur was obviously October of 73. So about 8 months later, she retires and resigns to basically say, look, I took responsibility for this. There's differences of opinion on how much responsibility she really had for it, but she said the buck stops with me, and she retired. She resigned. She had health issues by that point, but she retired. And then Yitzhak Rabin becomes prime minister, and he becomes the prime minister for the first time because, of course, he's going to come back and be prime minister later, and he's the prime minister during the Raid on Entebbe, which we'll talk about. But this first 30 years or so of Israel's existence is going to be marked by three very important armed conflicts. There's going to be three wars during this time that help shape Israel's identity. And to some extent, the people who are involved in these wars also shape Israel's identity because the military leaders here wind up also becoming prime ministers and leaders, including Yitzhak Rabin, and then, of course, also people like Ariel Sharon. So we're going to talk about the first of those battles, the first war that Israel is in after the War of Independence, which is Israel's first major war, is we have the War of 1956. Now, some of you know this war, some of you have heard about it. As um, I want to have people be very clear. Here's the map of 56, the 56 war. And I'll put this up right now for everybody to see. And this is an interesting piece of history that I think a lot of people don't know. And it's something that um, I think is particularly right now very relevant because the Suez Crisis or the Suez War, depending on what people call it, some people call it the Second Arab-Israeli War, the War of Sinai. This war has a lot of similarities, I think, to the current war that we have been fighting or has been fought or is on pause or is on break in Iran right now. And why do I say that? Because some people might know this. This was a war in 1956 that Israel fought with the English and the French. That's right. Israel fought a war with England and France in 1956. Now, the president of this at this time of the United States is none other than somebody in 1956, one of our great military leaders, 1956.
Eisenhower.
Eisenhower. That's
Yeah,
correct.
Eisenhower.
Eisenhower is president. And of course, the United States has been fighting in Korea, and the situation in the United States, to some extent, is that the United States does not want to ramp up confrontation with the Soviet Union. And that has a major effect on what happens here in 1956. Because in 1956, what precipitates the war is the fact that Nasser, Nasser, who's the premier, he's the leader of Egypt. Hold it 1 second. Let me just mute out. Somebody's got sound coming through. Yeah. Nasser, who's leading Egypt at the time, decides to nationalize the Suez Canal, which is right here. Sounds a lot like the Straits of Hormuz, right? Sounds a lot like what we're dealing with today. So, as some of you might remember, in the 1800s, the French and the British helped build the Suez Canal, and the British continued to manage the Suez Canal all the way up to the 50s. And as part, I would say, of the struggles and the wider issues that were going on here, the United States, as I mentioned, does not want to have a full out war with the Soviet Union, but there is obviously jockeying in position for who's going to have relationships with these countries, with these smaller countries. And Egypt is kind of playing both sides. Egypt is trying to stay close to the United States and Europe, and at the same time, staying close to the Soviet Union. Egypt is in the process of building it's not on this map, but they're trying to build the Aswan Dam, which is going to totally change the Nile and electricity and power and water for their country. But and they want outside investment in that infrastructure, but they also know that by controlling the Suez, they will control and will be able to dictate the flow of supplies from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. And so in 1956, uh, Nasser nationalizes, takes over ownership for Egypt of the Suez. And the French, who paid for this, who helped build it, and the British, who helped maintain it with, by the way, one of the largest forces of any country in the world at the time is um, the English Army's garrisons here in the Suez area. They say you can't. They basically tell Egypt you can't do this. Now, what happened, of course, is the United States is trying to figure out how to play uh, not really both sides in this argument. They don't want to see the Suez be taken over, but they want to have a relationship with Egypt. And Eisenhower and the State Department really tries its best to keep Egypt within our sphere. But the Soviets are obviously trying to do the same thing. They're trying to get Egypt to go over to their side. Well, the British and French, in conjunction with Israel basically takes Israel's border at the time, right here. It's actually where Israel's border is now. Israel invades the Sinai. And this again, this is 1956. This is the end of October. The war here will go on for about 10 days. The Israeli army comes across, goes into Gaza, by the way, which at the time, of course, is controlled by Egypt. It's not a Palestinian homeland. It's where the Egyptian army is stationed. And by the way, consistently over the last few months, the Egyptians have been letting Arab raiding parties called Fedayeen, they've been allowing them to come across from Gaza into Israel to kill and attack Jewish cities in Israel. There had been a time when he wasn't allowing it, but at this time in 56, he is allowing it to happen. So the Israelis attack the Egyptian positions here in Gaza, and then they come across very fast through the Sinai Desert, and they come all the way here to the Suez Canal. Now, you can see the Israeli units halted on a line 10 miles from Suez Canal on the 2nd of November. This attack from Israel is supplemented by French and British paratroopers landing in the right at the Suez, right at those bases, and taking over those bases. Now, I want to make it clear. This operation, which the British called Operation Musketeer, is completely successful. People died, by the way. It's not like no Israelis or no British and French died. About 170 Israelis are killed, about 800 are wounded. The United Kingdom loses 22 people killed, 96 wounded, and the French have 10 killed and 33 wounded. The Egyptians lose probably close to about 3,000 dead and about 5,000 wounded. About 215 Egyptian aircraft are destroyed, and about 125 Egyptian tanks are destroyed. About 30,000 Egyptian soldiers are captured, mostly here in the Sinai, and of course here at the places in the Suez where they had cut it off. Now, what happened at the end of this very quick battle, about 10 days? Well, the United Nations and the United States and the Soviet Union tell Israel to go back. You must go back. We will make sure that the Suez will be open for your ships. That's part of the agreement. We're also going to place United Nations soldiers here. This is the first deployment of United Nations troops in the Middle East. They're going to be deployed here to protect and to stop the Egyptian army from taking control again of this area or attacking you from that area. And the French and the British are told by the United States, by Eisenhower and the State Department, in no uncertain terms, you have to go back. Now, the French are not happy with this at all. The French end up, a few years later, actually pulling out of NATO. They came back to NATO about 30 years later, but they pulled out of NATO after this, after being told by the United States, you have to leave. The British, I think they kind of took it in a stoic British upper lip. They left as well, and they, for the most part, maybe with the exception of the Falkland War, the British will never, ever, ever get involved in another situation like this, especially one where they're not on the same page with the United States. Doesn't happen. Doesn't happen again. The British and French are pretty much told, you're not part of this anymore. You can follow, you can be part of NATO, you can be part of our umbrella of defense, but you don't have the power to do this kind of stuff anymore. You're done. The big boys are now at the table, the US and the Soviet Union. Now, the French, by the way, not long after this, decide to develop their own. Again, they drop out of NATO in the 60s. They develop their own nuclear program. They pretty much say we're not going to be treated like this. Yeah. So at the end of 56, Israel goes back to its line, and the Egyptians were very humiliated. You'd think that they would have learned their lesson, but as we know, they don't learn their lesson, because in 1967, 10 years later, the same prime minister, who's now a little bit older, but again, you could say no, not any wiser, decides to start another war, provoke Israel into another war, in what we call the Six-Day War. Now, the Six-Day War, we call it the Six-Day War. I've had a few people in the military explain to me that it was actually a one-day war. The war was over in one day. Why? Because Israel destroyed the entire air force of the Egyptians on the first day. They had air superiority from day one, the end of day one. But this will now be the second, and not the last time, but the second time that Israel will invade the Sinai, once again, capture the Sinai, and in some cases, going along the same paths. They capture the Sinai, and at the end of 67, they will not give back the Sinai this time. Not yet. They won't give back the Sinai. Now, the Six-Day War, by many people, has been described as almost miraculous because Israel not only was attacked, and again, Israel attacked first, but Israel not only, after, again, the Suez and the Straits of Tiran down here were captured by, were blockaded by the Egyptians. The Egyptians had forces here. They didn't capture it. They were there. They were in the Suez and they were at Sharm el Sheikh at the Straits of Tiran down here. They cut off these 2 points so boats couldn't go to Israel, to Eilat, or come around here and go to all the ports along Israel's Mediterranean. So Israel attacked Egypt again, and then of course once Israel attacked Egypt, the other countries along Israel's border also attacked Israel. So what happens is Israel winds up fighting Syria and fighting Jordan, in addition to Egypt. So Israel winds up with the Gaza and the West Bank and the Golan. So these areas on the map, these are areas that Israel has today, with the exception of the Sinai, which we'll get to, of course, in a moment, because we'll get to the third time Israel conquers and captures the Sinai Peninsula. The Six-Day War, to put it again into perspective, Israel fights again against 5 nations: Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and even again Iraq sends troops in. Iraq that has no common border. There's Lebanon, there's Syria, there's Jordan, there's Egypt. Iraq has no common border, but once again sends in a military force. Israel defeats all 5 of those nations. Israel told Jordan not to be involved in this war. They didn't listen. And consequently, because Jordan participated, they ended up losing their management of this territory, which of course they had not given to the Palestinians for the previous 20 years. The casualties in this war, Israel lost many more soldiers in this war because the 56 war was essentially for Israel just a capture of the Sinai. In this case, there's also the battles in the Golan and also obviously the battles for Jerusalem. But in this war, about just under 1,000 Israelis are killed, about 4,500 are wounded. On the Egyptian side, upwards of between 12 and 15,000 Egyptians were killed. Up to 2,500 Syrians were killed. Jordan lost about 700 soldiers were killed. And again, many more were captured. But it's difficult to put into terms how disproportionate the destruction was for Israel's enemies.
This was the year that Nixon was president and Schlesinger was.
No. In 1967, Kissinger isn't president. Kissinger isn't Secretary of State and Nixon isn't president. That will be in 73. So
Okay.
in 67, we're still dealing with the legacy of John F. Kennedy and Democratic presidency of Lyndon Johnson. Now, in 67, as Israel's fighting the Six-Day War, up until this point, At this point, Israel is still not receiving weapons from the United States. It's hard for people to understand this because we know that Israel and the United States have such a tight military cooperation today. But that wasn't the case for the first 20 years of Israel's existence. It's one of those things that, again, when we talk about what we're going to talk about, what we're going to learn that you don't know, was that Israel did not have that type of relationship with the United States. The State Department of the United States, through Republican and Democratic administrations, was fairly opposed to helping Israel, with the understanding that it didn't make sense to help Israel and it was not in the United States' best interest to essentially cut off the Arab world. The Arab world is basically saying you choose Israel or you choose us. You can't have both. And for the most part, the United States was following the lead of the practical side, which says you go with the greater numbers of people, you go with the greater numbers of nations, you go with the oil.
Now,
Why would
that's
you
what I was
why
going
would
to.
you do that?
It's not the numbers of people. It was all about oil.
Yeah.
All
And so
about oil.
all of this leads us to what's changed, right? How are we different? We're going to get to that. But I want you to understand that's where we are in 1967. The 1967 war, what we call the Six-Day War, the June War, or now the Third Arab-Israeli War, this war was a game changer in so many ways. But it was also the last time that Israel is going to depend on Europe for weapons. Because what France did on the eve of the 67 war, and a lot of people don't know this, was France started embargoing arms to Israel. And there's some amazing stories. A great book was written about the boats of Cherbourg. Israel, literally, the Mossad went into France and sailed out missile boats that they had paid the French for, and the French had embargoed because the Arabs had said, don't let them go. And those missile boats ended up playing a key role in the 67 war. Now, Israel was in a jam because they knew that this was the reality that they were looking at. They were looking at the end of the 60s, they were looking at a situation now where the Soviet Union had completely turned on them. The Soviet Union was completely arming Egypt and Syria at this point. And Egypt and Syria at this point had a military and literally were almost functioning as one country at the time. It was called the United Arab Republic. And these countries were working so closely together. And they were being armed by the Soviets. And so Israel was in a very big jam right now in 1967. And to go back to that moment, this was uh, Israel ended up winning a war which they were not expecting to have the 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 success that they had, because Israel wound up controlling this entire area here, which is twice as big as their country, the Sinai, and then of course coming into control of the West Bank and Gaza. So in some ways, the 67 war changes the dynamic. Golan, of course, as well, but nowhere near as many people in the Golan as there are in the West Bank or Gaza. So this is how Israel winds up controlling a much larger Arab population than
Why,
they
how
had
is it
before.
France's benefit to help Israel? Why did they do
Well,
that? Why is it,
France
was it,
France was this in the same situation, which was we are going to work with the Arabs because we need the oil, we need we need to some extent we need to tampen down the tension. France, as most of you know, they went overboard. They ended up basically allowing their country to be overrun by people who came from places like Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria as former French colonies. They basically let a whole lot of people into their country to change the dynamic of what's happening in France. At the time, that wasn't the case. But what was happening in France was they were trying not to upset the Algerians and some of these other Arab countries even more by favoring Israel. And so each so it didn't even matter what it didn't even matter what Egypt and Syria were doing. There was also this issue of just not upsetting the Arab countries that they were trying to repair relationships with and were
Maybe I
trying to make.
maybe I misunderstood. I thought that France had sold arms to Israel.
I told you, not only did they sell arms, but in 56 they fought a war together.
Right, right. So why are they selling
So
arms to
10
Israel?
years later, 10 years later, France is now literally embargoing weapons that Israel has paid them for.
Okay.
Again, most people don't know that. They don't talk about it. It's not part of the discussion because, it's like, well, on top of everything else that happened, yeah, that happened. That happened. So if you want to read about the how Israel essentially made sure that they had the weapons for 67, yeah, this is what happened. Now, I will tell you that things start to change in the United States with the relationship between Israel and the United States. That by the next war, by 73, that's not the case. Now, we'll get to that, but I want to touch on one of the most important parts of 1967, which was, again, the miracle of 1967. And we really call it a miracle because Israel did not expect to have this type of victory. It was a complete victory. Do you understand? Israel wound up with literally 27,000 square miles of territory. Israel wasn't even, to some extent, some people say, prepared for what to do really at this moment. And there's even a plan that Israel is going to once again retreat from all the land that they had just taken in 67 war in order to have peace with the Arabs around them. And according to the Alon plan, the Yigal Alon plan, you saw one of the early prime ministers of Israel was Yigal Alon. Alon had come up with a plan to literally have Israel give up all of the West Bank, which they had just controlled, Gaza, all of the Sinai, all of Golan, in exchange for lasting peace and arrangements for cooperation between their Arab neighbors. And the
Ra-
Arabs refused it.
Rabbi,
Yes.
didn't they also get after the 6 Day War access to Jerusalem again?
I was just going to say that, but you're absolutely right. When we talk about, that's what I was going to say. The um, the great miracle of 67 was control of Egypt, and I mean of Egypt, of Jerusalem. And one of the things that you have to understand was that one of the parts of Alon's plan and any plan for peace for Israel was that Israel would never again give up control of the old city, ever. That was non-negotiable. So Israel basically said, um, if there is some type of whatever type of arrangement goes on in the West Bank, whatever type of arrangement then goes on for any part of the land that Israel would vacate, Jerusalem would never be vacated again. The old city would never be vacated. And so Israel's control of Jerusalem, Israel's when Israeli soldiers went to the wall in 67, the pictures you've seen of the people standing at the wall, weeping at the wall. I'll show you one right now, the most famous one.
Just
When,
watching
when
of it, and they said the Shekianu. It was
yeah,
very.
yeah, they blew the shofar and they these are people who, for the most part, many of them were not religious. When they stood at the wall, when they when they were there for the first time, it was an emotional moment for them. And I mean, this is the most famous picture that Micha Baram took. Um, let's see. Um, Let me just show you this. Israel also was able to capture. Israel was able to capture the wall um, with a minor with and the old city with a very small level of fatalities. Israel did its best. These are the three guys later that the three of them at the wall. So the pictures of Israeli soldiers being at the wall is one of the most famous pictures like ever since. But the first moment in 67 when Israel had once again reunited the Jewish people with the wall. Because again, up until 1948, Jews could go to the wall, but ever since the Jordanians controlled, they wouldn't let Israelis, they wouldn't let Jews go to the wall. So this was what happened during the 67 war. Many people say, again, just that alone would have been the miracle, enough of a miracle. But again, Israel winds up with these territories, the West, what we call, some people call the West Bank, some people call Judea and Samaria, and Gaza. Now, over the next, as we know, over the next 40 years, Israel will settle all of these areas, the Golan, the West Bank, and Gaza. Golan today is been annexed and it's considered part of the part of Israel. The United States recently recognized it as part of Israel. But the United States is one of the few countries in the world that have recognized the Golan as part of Israel, even though Israel annexed it, I think, in 1981. The West Bank has not been formally annexed. There is discussion that Israel would do it in the next few years when they believe that they have an opportunity to do so. But Trump has said flat out that they're not supposed to do that. They can't do that. So Israel is not legitimately going to be doing that anytime soon, but you never know. I mean, stranger things have happened. And Gaza, starting after 1967, Israel settled 11 kibbutzim and communities, moshavim, inside the Gaza area. Those 11 kibbutzim were functioning in Gaza for the next 40 years until 2007. And in 2007, as many of you might recall, about 20 years ago, while Ariel Sharon was prime minister, he evacuated those areas. He forcibly removed any Jews that were still in Gaza and told the people of Gaza, you're on your own. You can do anything you want with this place. And over the next 20 years, they turned it into the headquarters for one of the most bloodthirsty terrorist organizations in the world, Hamas. That's what the people of Gaza decided to do in the last 20 years. But Israel turned it over again, from 1967 to 2007, Jews lived in Gaza. But in 2007, every Jew was evacuated. There are no Jews that live in Gaza. It's a completely Jew-free place. And that's what you have. And there are Jews that lived in Gaza, by the way, up until 1948, up until the War of Independence. There were Jews that lived in Gaza for thousands of years. There were synagogues in Gaza. There were people who lived in Gaza in the Talmud, the time of the Talmud. It was an area where, along the coast, where, again, not necessarily a lot of Jews lived, but there were Jews that lived there. There are no Jews there. For the last 20 years, there are no Jews living in Gaza. Not except people that were being held hostage for 2 years.
What
Other
was
than that,
Sharon's reason for doing that?
he felt that if we evacuated, I'll get to it next week, it was part of his and the United States plan that if Israel was going to create Palestinian territories that would one day be a country, they would start with Gaza, as that it has a contiguous landmass that they could effectively turn into a Palestinian state, and it did not work out well. We'll
I
get to
think,
that. We'll
Rabbi,
get to
I
that
think
next week. Yes.
two things to address Esther's question. I do believe in their heart of hearts, based on very limited reading that I've done, but I've done some reading on it, that they knew they were going to fail, that their hatred for us was so bad, and this was a way to show the world stage, and this dovetails into what had to be done. No, let me rephrase that. What was forced on them in the aftermath of the 67 war. Everyone gets pissed off today because their memories are short. They're all mad today about gunboat diplomacy of what we're doing now, right? Well, after the 67 war, everybody needs to remember there was diplomacy called land for peace. It's like, well, you already got your butts kicked, and now you want your land back because, well, you're just going to terrorize us if we don't, which they ended up doing anyway for 50 years. I'm done.
So I think those are all valid points, all things that we can think about. And of course, look, when we get to it, we're not talking about it today. But we're going to talk about the evacuation of Gaza. Part of it might have also, I will say, John, was Israel did not want there to be elections held there right away, and George W. Bush forced elections in that area. And of course, Hamas won the elections in 2007. So there was a real feeling that Israel had that if this is going to work in any stretch of the imagination, you do not allow them to have free elections when they're going to basically put Hamas in charge. So I don't know, John. I mean, I would say if that was the case, then Israel would have said, we don't care that you hold elections. But it's very well known that Sharon told Bush, do not force elections. We know you want democracy, but you will not get democracy. So that was again, it's it's part of the questions of what if. But of course, 1967 will not be the last major war that Israel fights because there will be a fourth war. The fourth war, of course, is the 1973 war, which we've talked about a little bit in different aspects over in the synagogue over the last few years because um, this war, while it's not seen in some ways as important as 1967, in many ways it is, and in some ways it's more important because it puts into our minds and it puts into the reality of who we are. And I don't mean just Jews and people who love Israel, but Americans. It puts into mind several issues which I think are still very much playing out. Though again, 67, put it all on the table as well. And you can make the argument if it wasn't for 67, 73 war wouldn't have played out the way it did. But remember, up until this time, as I showed you on that map of the prime ministers of Israel up until this time still, by the way, all from one party, from the Labor Party, Mapai or Mapam. It's called different things through different coalitions and arrangements, but it's the Labor Party. It's the left-wing party that's in charge of Israel and is very much growing Israel as this is happening. There are still people, as we said, in the 50s and 60s that are coming to Israel from primarily Arab countries now. They're making aliyah in some cases with nothing. I showed you the tents that they're being set up with in the 50s and 60s. Jews from Iraq, Jews from Syria, Jews from Egypt that are being forced out, especially after the 67 war. Any Jews in Egypt who made it through in 1967, they got out. That was it. They were done living in Egypt. And a Jewish community that went back thousands of years was now virtually gone. The Egyptian Jewish community left. Most of them went to Israel. Many of them came to the UK or other parts of Europe, some to the United States. Our friend Rita Rafat, we love. We love when she's at synagogue. She was actually, her husband, unfortunately, passed away a few years ago. She was married to a Muslim. If she had not been married to a Muslim, she doesn't know whether she would have survived. She ended up coming to the United States with him. But the amazing thing is that like many of her family, all of her family evacuated, they lost everything. Her family had been living in Egypt for centuries, and they left with nothing. And and that happened across the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq. I told you Damascus had a Jewish community that rivaled percentage-wise what New York City is as a Jewish community, 10, 15% in Damascus, 10 to 15% at times in Baghdad. Those Jewish communities ceased to exist within a period of 2 or 3 years. Yemen, which has a huge Jewish community up until the late 50s, early 60s, gone. The Yemenite community, for the most part, is evacuated on Operation Magic Carpet. They are brought to Israel as almost homeless, basically homeless refugees. And so in 1973, 6 years after the war that changed everything, if you will, the 67 war, we have another war, which is going to, if it doesn't change everything, if it doesn't really change the borders, it definitely changes the psychology and the mentality of what goes on in Israel. And I will tell you this. We've talked about this. I talked about it. People said, how did you know? I did a sermon on Yom Kippur of 2023 telling people that we have become too complicit, which is the lesson from Yom Kippur, not to be complicit, not to think that our neighbors can't attack us. And I put it into terms of it's not just about Israel, it's not just about war, it's about whenever we get to a point where we're not paying attention because we're too comfortable. Not that we shouldn't relax, not that we shouldn't have, an understanding of what the reality is, but never think that you have everything prepared, that you should never think about what could happen in a worst case scenario. And that's, again, not about Israel, not about Jews, just about life. Doesn't mean you always be afraid, but you have to be realistic and you have to look at the signals. If somebody tells you that something is going wrong, don't dismiss it. It doesn't mean you have to believe it, but don't say it can't happen. And that was the lesson that Israel learned. In Yom Kippur of 1973, Israel was warned repeatedly that Egypt was about to attack. Repeatedly. You saw it in the Golda movie. If you saw this movie, The Angel, that was a very good Netflix movie about a guy who was spying for Israel in Egypt, warning them about it. The movie basically implies that he did that to Israel so that there'd be peace, so that Israel wouldn't believe it. I mean, I don't know. You can go back and forth on it, but what happens in 1973? What happens in 1973 is that Egypt catches Israel unprepared. And I think we don't talk about this as much, but one of the strengths that Egypt had, of course, they had been outfitted with tons and tons of military equipment from the Soviet Union. They had an enormous army by this point, and the person that's leading Egypt now at this point is no longer Nasser. Nasser had been humiliated in the 67 war, humiliated. And the new head of Egypt, the new dictator of Egypt. I don't want to call him a dictator because everybody loves him, but Anwar Sadat is now the control of Egypt. Again, he's a military man. He's a guy who, who served as, as a military leader under Nasser, but he's now in charge, and he's a lot more. Nasser was known for his bluster and for his ability to kind of be a popular leader. Sadat was much more shrewd. He was much more calculated, and quite frankly, Israel underestimated what he was capable of doing. And so Egypt attacks Israel. Israel in October, and of course they attacked Israel on the holiest day of the year. It was a time when, and by the way, October 7th happened because that was the anniversary, not of the fact that it was Simchat Torah, but that it was the anniversary of the October War. So when I tell you that this plays out for today, understand that our enemies consider this October War a victory for the Arabs. We're going to look at it, and I'm going to show you. And again, if you saw the Golda movie, or if you've seen some of the other movies that deal with 73, the movie Valley of Tears, the HBO series, it wasn't a movie, it was a limited series called Valley of Tears about what happens in Syria, which I'm going to show you in a second. There are some very, very powerful movies that have been made about this period, but Egypt attacks, crosses into the Sinai, and Israel has along this border something called the Bar Lev line. You see these triangles. These are military installations that Israel has installed along the border, along the Suez, to make sure Egypt wouldn't stop them from being able to go through the Suez Canal, but it gave Israel a false sense of security. The Bar Lev line has been compared to the Maginot line in Europe, which supposedly was going to keep out the Germans. It leads people to, again, be very careful of telling people, well, if you have a very strong, fixed line, that you're going to be able to protect yourselves. Israel had a similar situation, obviously, with Gaza on October 7th. So you can see the Egyptian army came all the way here, completely overran the Bar Lev line. And by the time Israel is able to mass an army against this, to field an army about a week later, you can see that Israel is able to stop the Egyptian army, and That is as far as the Egyptians got. That was not the only place where there was a war, right? Because the Syrians also attacked. They came across the Golan Heights and were able to overrun the Israeli army and take out these positions here, which were the fixed line that Israel had in the Golan. The Valley of Tears movie miniseries focuses on these lines right here that were overrun. As you can see, Israel was able to repulse the Syrian army. In the movie, in the Golden movie, there's a scene in that movie where Moshe Dayan is flying over and watching this unfold as this is unfolding, as the Syrian attack is unfolding. He's watching Israeli soldiers being overrun, the Israeli tanks being overwhelmed here. And he's throwing up. He's so sick by it that he's throwing up. Now, Israel is able, as again, these movies have shown, and the movie Gold has showed. Oh, I just want to make something else clear. In 1973, Israel was warned through intelligence. That's also in the movie Valley of Tears. Some of the intelligence that was ignored. As we said, some of the Egyptian spies that were giving Israel information that seemed to have been ignored. Folks, what isn't talked about oftentimes is that Israel was warned about this war by you know who else? King Hussein. That's right. King Hussein, the king of Jordan, 2 weeks before the war, flew to Tel Aviv secretly and told Golda Meir that this was going to happen. And it was not listened to. They did not think that the Arabs could beat them. The 67 war had given Israel such a sense of security, such a sense of military prowess, that there's nothing that could be done to them. This war went on for almost 3 weeks. And during the war, which was one of the bloodiest for Israel, almost 3,000 Israelis were killed in battle. Now, on the Egyptian side, once again, maybe up to 15,000 Egyptians were killed. Syrians, 3,500. You know, maybe 20,000 Arab soldiers were killed during this war, maybe more. After the war, after the battles had stopped, Israel wound up, as you can see, about 20 miles from Damascus, 40 kilometers from Damascus, 35 kilometers from Damascus, right here. This is how far Israel had gone into Syria. This was the border before. This is where Israeli forces had gone. In Egypt, this was where the battle lines were when the war was over. Egypt still controlled some of what Israel had controlled before the war, but nothing compared to what Israel controlled here. You understand? And not only that, Egypt's Third Army is completely surrounded by Israelis. The famous story that Golda Meir, and they showed in the movie, the Third Army and part of the Second Army too, right? where literally Golda Meir could have wiped every one of those soldiers out. It's true. They're surrounded. So that's where Israel wound up on the other side of the Suez on that. And again, this is where Egypt was on that side. So after the war, they basically go back to in 73, they go back to the
Rabbi,
border here. Yeah, we're one side of the Suez. Yeah.
wasn't that the decision she had to make, right? To let them go or to kill them
Yeah.
all?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. In the movie, they show her deciding literally the fate of thousands of Egyptian soldiers. 30, I think it was 25, 30,000 soldiers. I mean, Israel still wound up capturing over 8,000 Egyptian soldiers. And they completely wiped out Egypt's ability to fight another tank battle. Now, here's the thing. There are no territorial gains, net gains. I mean, if you look at this is not a net gain. This is a loss, right? This is the boundary, right? So Israel and much of the world considered it a loss for Israel. A lot of people consider that this war was the game changer, which changed the Middle East. Because remember, when the war was over, the United States had now become the main patron supporter of Israel. Now, that came with certain costs because Kissinger, as you see in the movie Golda, basically goes to Golda and says, you can't you can't continue fighting, right? Whereas Golda's saying, look, we got to make sure the Egyptians can't ever attack us again. Kissinger says, no, the war's over. It's over. You're done. And Israel had no choice. The only country they can get weapons from at this point is the United States. And as people have talked about, the United States and the Soviet Union were at the highest DEFCON alert that they'd ever been at during the Yom Kippur War. There was a fear that the United States and the Soviet Union would actually go to war over this war. And so it changes the dynamic because it becomes very clear after 73 that Israel is now deeply connected with the United States and the Soviet Union is now the patron for Egypt and Syria and Iraq and most of the Arab countries that surround Israel. Now, that being said, the 73 war also opens up. Oh, very important for the politics of the world. What happens after the Yom Kippur War in the world, folks? What happens to the United States after the 73 war? Somebody remember? It's also very relevant to today. Do you remember
Vietnam?
do you remember what happened to the price of oil in 1973?
Oh, yeah, the price of oil went way up. We stood in lines.
Yeah.
Odd days.
The price of oil doubled. The
The
price
oil
of oil doubled.
embargo.
Yep.
Yeah,
And
odd
so
days on our license plates.
now I will tell you that in 73, the price of a barrel of oil was $2 a barrel. $2 a barrel. And it went up to $4 a barrel almost overnight. But it was it was bad. And then of course it gets up to $12 a barrel by 1980. The good old days when that was only $12 a barrel. But in all fairness, I mean, look, that's $1973. But yeah, that's what happens. The Arab world punishes the United States and pretty much anybody that's going to support Israel. The United States at least has the courage to continue to support Israel. A lot of the countries outside of the United States begin to cut off relations with Israel. So Israel, which had really great relationships with a lot of African nations, almost overnight in 73, these countries are closed their embassies and closed their relationships with Israel under that pressure. You see companies that are pressured. Coke is basically told if you sell your products in Israel, you will not be able to sell them in the Arab world. And that's how Coke became the drink of Israel and Pepsi became the drink of the Arab world. I think we did better out of that arrangement myself, but yeah, that was the deal. You couldn't get a Coke in Saudi Arabia, or I should say Saudi Arabia. You could because they're American bases, but you couldn't get a Coke in Egypt. But you could, but you also couldn't get a Pepsi in Israel. It's true. When I was a kid, and I didn't care, I don't like Pepsi, but you couldn't get a Pepsi. Maybe one of the reasons I don't like Pepsi is because Pepsi complied with the boycott. And countries were not supposed to comply with boycotts of Israel, but yet they did. American companies found loopholes and ways around it. And so it was impossible, for example, to buy a Honda in Israel. It was impossible to get any Japanese car except for Subaru in Israel in the 1970s and 80s because countries complied with these boycotts. So 73 war puts into motion worldwide to some extent um, isolation of Israel, which drives Israel further and further towards the United States. And of course, after the 73 war, Israel starts to work on creating, and largely again because of Sadat, who almost immediately after the war starts to try to figure out if there's a way to create a peace treaty with Israel, with again Israel giving up for the third time the Sinai Peninsula. Israel conquered the Sinai in 56. They conquered it in 67, and they once again have to conquer it in 73. And by conquer it, I mean Israelis died for this area, including, by the way, we keep showing this part by the Suez, but also down here by the Straits of Tiran, a place called Sharm el-Sheikh, which Israel literally has soldiers dying, in some cases 3 times in the same place, to capture land that they will once again give back. So Israel in 1973 begins to negotiate with Egypt, and only 4 years later will enter into the Camp David Accords, which of course happens with Jimmy Carter as president, with Anwar Sadat as the prime minister of Egypt, and of course Menachem Begin as the prime minister of Israel. Well, what had happened? Well, that's a big story because Israel now has a different leadership, has a different party in charge of the show, which is that in 1977, Likud takes over. And so for the first time in 30 years, almost 30 years, you have a party besides Labor that now takes charge. Now, it'd be one thing if we said Menachem Begin won because everyone loved Menachem Begin. No, that's not the case. Menachem Begin was a very shrewd politician, as a lot of people have known, and we talked about it briefly. He was the head of the Irgun, which was the furthest right-wing Jewish Liberation Party and military group during the War of Independence, up to the War of Independence, when Israel organized the Haganah around just one army. The Irgun used to be the hardcore, very anti-British, very anti everything other than let's kick everybody out now and it's we're done. We're done talking. He is the head of the Irgun and will become the leader of the right-wing party in Israel, which is called Likud, which is really a block. It's not one party. It's several right-wing parties that eventually get enough power to take the leadership. And that's a big shift in Israel. Now, this wasn't just a case of a guy being elected, because again, it's not a person, it's a party. Well, what happens? Well, the Labor Party, the party that's in charge at the time of the 73 war, was definitely being held accountable for the surprise and the fact that so many Israelis were psychologically traumatized by the war. It's the worst moment in Israeli history until October 7th. And so this was a terrible part of Israel's history, and one that the leadership of Israel uh, people felt needed a clean slate. The other thing that happened, of course, was the Entebbe rescue in 1976. Israel was watched as Jews and Israelis were taken hostage by Palestinian terrorists, also aided by the Red Army factions, by German terrorists, German socialist terrorists. They took hostages from a plane that, again, is flying towards Europe, takes them to Entebbe, takes the plane to Entebbe. And as many people saw the movies that were made about the Entebbe rescue, Israel rescues the hostages. There are losses of life, including losses of the hostages. And most importantly, one Israeli soldier is killed. Yonatan Netanyahu, Bibi Netanyahu's older brother, he dies in leading the rescue of the hostages. But it's an amazing rescue operation that happens in the Entebbe airport in Uganda. Israel flew to Uganda to rescue the hostages in a raid that many people thought was an impossible intelligence and not just an intelligence victory, but also a tremendous military operation, amazing military operation in 76. But Rabin, who was prime minister during that time, has to resign. And he doesn't resign because of Yom Kippur. He doesn't resign because of Entebbe. If anything, people thought Entebbe was an amazing operation, gave people a little bit of confidence after the 73 war. Does anyone know why Rabin resigned? Anybody? Does anybody know? Because this will be then something you learn today. Did
I
anybody
do
know?
not. I do not.
Anybody? Rabin.
I mean, I can cheat and look quickly, but I won't.
No, don't. Does anybody know? I'm giving everyone a chance.
Nope.
It was called the
Steins don't
dollar.
know.
It was called the dollar affair. And what happened was,
It's
while
dollar
Rabin was having
affair.
the dollar affair, as in dollars, because what happened was Rabin was in the United States with his wife Leah for a meeting with Jimmy Carter, and while he was there, Leah Rabin was seen making a withdrawal from a U.S. bank. At the time, it was illegal for an Israeli prime minister to have a bank account outside of the United States. Now, Rabin had been the ambassador to the United States from 78 to 70, 68 to 73. He had been in the United States for a long time. But the problem was he never reported it. If it was allowed to continue, it shouldn't have continued while he was prime minister. And that forced him to resign. Can you imagine? That happened. And so when Menachem Begin becomes prime minister in 77, this is a time for Israel to some extent, have a reboot. And part of that reboot is going to be the Camp David Accords. And the Camp David Accords, a lot of the work had been done before Begin was prime minister. Okay, so there were people like Moshe Dayan, who everyone remembers Moshe Dayan, the great general, who works for these people, like David Ben Gurion and Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin, who's I mean, Rabin's younger than Moshe Dayan, but they're contemporaries. But these negotiations had been going on before Menachem Begin became prime minister. But while he's prime minister, they reach their fruition. And it's an amazing thing because, again, the Egyptians say, we're going to have peace with Israel. We're going to recognize Israel. We're going to have peace with Israel. Whatever happens with the Palestinians, that's yet to be determined. But in the meantime, we're going to have a peace treaty with Israel. And of course, Egypt, it was a major issue. It was a major issue because it said that there is at least the possibility that Israel can have a relationship with its neighbors. Of course, it's going to take another 20 years almost for Israel, 15 years for Israel to have relationships with its other neighbors, but that set everything into motion. And of course, as you remember, Anwar Sadat was assassinated in Egypt for signing this peace treaty with Israel. His own people killed him because it was seen as a betrayal of the Arab people. But this was a major, major victory for Israel to have peace. It's one of the reasons why Egypt, to some extent, felt that they won the War of 73 because in their minds they forced Israel to come to peace. Well, the weird thing was is that that's a mentality disconnect because Israel wanted to have peace. And again, Sadat knew that. It's not like he didn't know Israel wanted to have peace, but the way that it was phrased, this was essentially a victory for it's for a victory for Egypt. And so Egypt felt that the Yom Kippur War was most definitely um, a victory for them, whereas most people would say you didn't really secure any territory, but this is this is not the way it was seen in the Arab world. And when I went to Egypt in 1980 something, I traveled across this. Well, you can travel across it right now, my friends, because it's still there. Here's the October 6th bridge, which goes right across the Nile River. So one of the major bridges in Egypt. And I remember going across the bridge and thinking to myself, yeah, it says it was completed in 96, but it was already there in the 80s, trust me. Um, it seems strange to me that that they would um, name a bridge after the Yom Kippur War. But yeah, that's considered a victory in Egypt. Why? Because Israel ended up once again abandoning, leaving behind the Sinai, evacuating it, turning it back to Egypt. So that is the 19 that takes us to 1977 to a new government, to a new reality, which Egypt and Israel now have a peace treaty. They now have a relationship. They now have tourism and travel that go between the countries. Allowed me to go in 1980, I guess it was 1988 to go to Egypt. But I can tell you that when I was there in 88, as I went across 88 or 89, as I went across, yeah, it was the end of 88. As I went across the Sinai Desert in 1988, I took a bus from Israel to Egypt. I actually took a bus through the Gaza Strip. That's the way the buses would go from Tel Aviv along the Gaza, along the Mediterranean through Gaza into Egypt. I passed by, folks, hundreds of Egyptian burned out tanks that the Egyptians still 10 years later had not removed from the desert as reminders of how their armies were destroyed both in 67 and then later on in 73. But yeah, those tanks were still there. The burned out tanks were still all over the place in the desert. So this is this takes us up to the late 70s. And when Menachem Begin was in in the last years of his time as prime minister, Israel begins a war to essentially uproot the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, which was headquartered in Lebanon. The initial operation is called Shalom LaGalil, or Sheleg, which is the acronym. It's Sheleg in Hebrew means snow, but Shalom LaGalil means peace for the Galilee. And the goal was to take out Palestinian terror camps that were in Lebanon. And this is where we're going to finish today in the early 80s. The operation becomes something that Israel had not intended it to be, which is a long-term campaign, a campaign that actually ends up going on for 20 years, which requires Israeli soldiers to be stationed in southern Lebanon for many, many years to try to create a buffer zone between um, between terror organizations in southern Lebanon with the northern border of Israel. Now, I remember that time pretty well in the early 80s. I was a teenager, and my dad was going to actually went into Lebanon a few times with celebrities from the United States to help them uh, visit and to basically kind of like do a USO tour to help comfort the soldiers, both in hospitals in Israel and also even in some cases going into Lebanon. And believe it or not, in 1983, my dad took Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden into Lebanon, into Beirut, while it was under control of the Israeli army. And Jane Fonda at the time was completely supportive of Israel doing what they needed to do to stabilize Lebanon. Because Lebanon, literally, for the last, I'm telling you right now, it's now going on almost 60 years, Lebanon has been a country that's been in constant turmoil. Part of it was because during the 70s, the Lebanese government allowed Palestinian terrorists to basically use their area as a place to attack Israel from. Once Israel knocked out the Palestinian terror groups, they fled from Lebanon. Yasser Arafat and his minions, they left. They went to Morocco. They went to other parts of North Africa. In some cases, also to Iraq. Other places where they were given safe haven. But the PLO was driven from Lebanon. Unfortunately, what replaced the PLO was not were not people who were interested in having peace with Israel. On the contrary, because Iran, which had just a few years before fallen to the Islamic dictatorship that's been in charge for the last 47 years, which we all know, we hear it every day, 47 years of the Iranian dictatorship, Islamic dictatorship that has supported the terror proxies and primarily Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And so Hezbollah took over a lot of the bases that were evacuated by the Palestinians, by the PLO, and they took them over. And again, Hezbollah were Lebanese Shiite Muslims. They were not from other countries. Israel really was kind of in a jam because they were Lebanese. They couldn't tell these people they couldn't live there because they were Lebanese. But the Lebanese government refused to disarm Hezbollah and allowed Hezbollah to take foothold in southern Lebanon. And Israel literally had to have soldiers there for 20 years, from the early 80s to the early 2000s. And what Israel had hoped was that the Christian minority in Lebanon would be effective at keeping Hezbollah out of power, and that is not what happened. Part of it is again people trying to get along. Some people want to get along, and other people don't want to get along. And when you have people who really don't want to get along, who have the power, doesn't matter how well intended those people are, they make it so that it's not livable. And I will tell you, it's not easy to say, well, these were Christians, these were Muslims, these were this, these were that. I want to tell you, you have to know this, that these discussions and these debates and these lines split families apart. Because you couldn't say every Christian Lebanese person wanted Israel to be there or wanted Israel to protect them, because not all of them did. Some of them wanted Hezbollah to be the people in charge, and this was a fact, and it drove families apart. I'm upset by it because we're still dealing with the process now going on, 40, 45, 50 years. But understand that like the Jamil family that were Christian leaders of Lebanon, the Jamil family, Bashir Jamil was friendly with Israel, wanted Israel to be there, wanted Israel to basically help stabilize the country. His brother Amin Jamil, no, he wanted to turn towards Syria and towards the other Arab countries, hoping that they would stabilize the country. Bashir Jamil was killed. He was assassinated. The hope that Israel had now 40 something years ago, almost 45 years ago, that they would have a peace with Lebanon went out the window when Bashir was assassinated because his brother didn't want to have peace with Israel. And so now, today, in 2026, and we'll get to it next week, we maybe are at the point where Lebanon and Israel might finally have a peace treaty, where Israel and Syria might finally have a peace treaty. But that hasn't been the case. Not through 67, not through 73, not through the Peace in the Galilee operations. None of those wars and none of those military operations were able to do it. But right now, there is a chance, folks, that there will be peace on the northern border between Israel and Lebanon and Israel in and Syria. And so next week we're going to talk about this period of time, which, as you can see, we've had lots of prime ministers, and we've had certain people come back a few times. This guy, Netanyahu, prime minister, prime minister, prime minister. We have Shimon Peres, who prime minister and then prime minister. Rabin, who comes back as prime minister. So we're going to see some of how we got even more to how we got here today. But again, there's a lot of stuff here that you probably as we can see, you're not aware of. Definitely when we get to next week, there's a lot of stuff that I can only tell you this is what it looks like is happening. We don't know because it's literally unfolding right now. We are still living in an October 7th, post October 7th world. It is not, this war of October 7th is not over. It might be over. I don't think it'll be over in a month, but it could be over by the end of the year. But we are in a period of war right now that's been going on it will be 3 years, probably by the time it's over. But this is a war which might have the biggest implications since 67 on what the Middle East looks like. I think that's already a foregone conclusion, my friends. I think no matter what, the pieces are in place for that to happen. But we're in the midst of a war right now. And if you don't believe it, if you don't think that this is a war going on right now, you're in denial. This is not necessarily a war where every day there's attacks, though in Lebanon, they're happening every day, folks. Every day there are Israeli soldiers who are either being killed or being injured every day in Lebanon. Every single day. You don't hear about it because we don't live in Israel and we don't get the reports in the Israel. I mean, you can if you get the Israeli reports, but this is a war that's going on right now. And there's been almost constant warfare since October 7th. Almost constant, almost every day. There have been some times when obviously the northern border was quiet. There have been some times when when Israelis were not necessarily on combat operations in Gaza, but for the most part, it's been ongoing since October 7th. There has not been a day that Israelis have not at least been in harm's way, have been in combat. There has not been a day since October 7th. So what does it mean? What does it look like? I don't know. The Lebanon war technically went on, as I said, for 20 years until Israeli soldiers completely removed themselves in the 2000s from Lebanon. There were Israeli soldiers that were being killed fairly, commonly in it was a common occurrence for Israelis to have reports of another Israeli battalion that was attacked in southern Lebanon. So we're in the midst of that now. I spoke today with a guy that a lot of you met a couple years ago, one of our kids who grew up at our temple was bar mitzvah at our temple. I spoke with Miles Rubin today, and Miles is back in the United States. For the last 2 years, he's been in Gaza. For the last 2 years, he's been in and out of operation, of military service. He left as soon as he was done with Colombia. I had him talk to us about that. He was part of the settlement, by the way. He did get part of the settlement from the Columbia University settlement. But when he was done, he felt guilty about not being in Israel with his fellow soldiers, and he went back. And again, for most of the last 2 years, he's been in and out of Gaza. So, I might have him talk about some of what he's allowed to talk about, but to have an American who actually has been there on the front lines, who's been there and seen it with his own eyes, it might be something that can prepare some questions for and talk to him about some of the questions you might have of what it's like. Definitely, he's had some traumatic experiences there, and I spoke to him for about an hour and a half today, and I'm going to see him hopefully in a couple of weeks. So we might see him. I will see if there's the right kind of moment to bring him to bring him to us. And again, as I always want you to have as much firsthand experience and discussion, so that this isn't just about pictures and maps, but you can actually see that. When I made sure we had some of the survivors of Nova come and talk, and as you know, we're going to be back in Israel in November this year. We're already working on some of the places and some of the people we're going to be meeting with in November, who are going to tell us about what life has been like over the last 3 years. Because I want you to hear it from the people who are there, and from the people who are living it, not what we read, and not what I can show you on a map or a picture, but for you to see it with as much to your own eyes. Okay. So, with that, I want to wish everyone a Chag Sameach. We're about to go into Shavuot. Friday night, we're going to have a very special Shavuot celebration for a Shabbat. We're going to have some cheesecake. We're going to have some blintzes. We're going to have an ice cream bar set up for the dairy holiday. It's a holiday where we celebrate with dairy. I don't know what to tell you if you're lactose intolerant. I guess we'll have some lactose-free stuff there too. We'll have some gluten-free stuff there, I'm sure, for Sharon and for the people who are celebrating. And I want to make it very clear, Camille, it's not that I think that people who are conservative are Islamophobic at all. I just want to make clear that you are not, no one should ever think that because somebody is liberal or conservative, that changes their take on this. I will tell you that my feelings on this are evolving, and I don't want to get into it now when we're already a little over time, but I will tell you that I wish I could tell you I'm hopeful that we have people in the Islamic world who will who we can interact with, and we can I've been searching them out, and I haven't found
Harbor
them.
Patrol.
So I will tell you, Camille, that is not what I meant. I meant that we need to make sure that uh, you do not have to be politically of any persuasion to be frustrated with the lack of sympathy. Yeah, the lack of sympathy and empathy that I think that we as Jews deserve, but we're not getting it. So that was what my point was. So, anyways,
Before
yes.
we cut, I had two occasions to talk with Anwar Sadat's daughter. I think it was his only daughter, Camila Sadat, who lives either in Brookline, Massachusetts, or Cambridge. I don't know which. I think she's a BU grad, Boston University. And it's interesting. He was her father. She loved him. And as hopefully any child would be, there is love and respect and feelings of loss. Listening to her, she was also unbelievably critical. And she's a regular face in a number of the synagogues in the Boston area.
She was critical of what?
Critical of him, his policies, his behaviors, not critical of peace, but critical of a lot of the things that went on in the background. Obviously, much more schooled in the history of what was going on then than I was. I just kept listening and tried to absorb what she had to say. But she is a staunch supporter of the Jewish people, and I think of Israel as well.
Well, that's really nice to hear. I don't know much about her. I think I saw her speak at some event, but I have I have not ever, I've never spoken to her one on one. But I do know that you know, watching her father be assassinated in front of the world must be traumatic. And again, whether or not I don't know, I have no idea whether he was a good father or not, but that is a that was the fact is he was killed because he wanted to have peace with Israel. So it's he was a victim, he was a martyr for peace in reality, and that is the fact. Whether or not he was whether or not he should have attacked Israel in 73, that's a question that I don't know how you can answer that. That's one of those ones where what if, but we do know that he was killed for peace. So, my friends, I look forward to seeing you. I want to tell you that for all those who obviously were also following, I wasn't following it, but I just got the alert that, of course, Dodgers won 4-0, which means they've given up they've given up 2 runs in the last 6 games. I want to point that out to all you people who think we don't have any defense, any pitching. All right, everybody, take care. Thanks.
Good
Thanks,
night.
Bye, all.
everybody.
Good night.